Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Motes. It's the third and final story of the 1983 Lando Calrissian adventures. Lando and Vufi Ra race across the galaxy to help a race of peaceful, spacefaring aliens called the Oswaft, who just happen to be able to produce some of the most valuable minerals in the galaxy. But of course, there's more to the siege of the Oswaft than meets the eye. It's Lando Calrissian and the Starcave of Thonboka by L. Neil Smith. And I'll talk about the book in just a few minutes. But first, it's listener question time. I have 2 emails today. The first comes from Leo, who says, "Hi Aaron, I love the podcast. My favorite Star Wars movie is Rogue One, and my favorite Star Wars show is Andor. I love how both stories don't really implement the Force. I think they're both made really well, and both have some of the best character development. People like Cassian Andor are not perfect, and I think it's more interesting when a protagonist is flawed like he is. What are your thoughts? Also, do you think there will be a movie on how the Rebellion got its intel on the second Death Star? Maybe something like Rogue 2. All we know so far is that a team of Bothans acquired them." Thank you very much for the email, Leo. You and I are on the same page. Rogue One is my favorite movie since the original trilogy, and Andor is my favorite live-action Star Wars show. Both of them deal with my favorite time period in Star Wars, the time of the growing rebellion against the Empire. And like you, Leo, the older I get, the more I'm drawn to the stories about how the non-Force users, aka the regular people, rise up to fight the Empire. Now, one area where we disagree a little bit is that I do think the Force does influence the story of Rogue One just a bit, specifically when Chirrut Imwe walks across the beach to throw the Master Switch and allows Jyn Erso to broadcast the Death Star plans to the Rebel fleet. Now, as far as whether or not we'll ever see a movie or any live-action story about how the Rebels got the plans for the second Death Star, I do not. I used to think we would, mainly because I've always wanted to see what a Bothan looks like in canon. I mean, at this point, I actually think it's intentional that Star Wars hasn't shown us a Bothan on the screen, and one of the members of Lucasfilm, Matt Martin, confirmed that in 2019 when he wrote on Twitter, quote, "It's pretty easy to confirm. We are purposely trying not to show them to leave all possibilities for when that story gets told. The dude in Resistance is based on the old expanded universe design of a Bothan that the animation art team used as reference for a background alien." Unquote. So, while there is still hope for that story, Leo, I no longer think we'll see it on screen. Because, if you remember, in the throne room, at the end of Return of the Jedi, the Emperor tells Luke that he intentionally allowed the plans for the second Death Star to be leaked to the Bothan spy network in order to lure the Rebel fleet to Endor and wipe them out. So while we may not know the ins and outs of how the Bothans got the Death Star plans, it doesn't sound nearly as interesting to me as the theft of the first Death Star plans do, if you believe Palpatine, of course. Thanks again for the email, Leo. Today's second email comes from Dawson, who says, "Is there any explanation for why we don't see Kyle Katarn during the Yuuzhan Vong War? We know he was around before the fall of the Empire, and he was part of the Jedi Council during the Legacy of the Force series as a battle master. If he was still a part of the Council during the Vong War, I would be surprised if he wasn't mentioned or utilized. Side theory, I think K2SO in Rogue One is a loose analog of Kyle Katarn. K2 is a reprogrammed Imperial droid. Kyle was a former stormtrooper, and both were involved in stealing the Death Star plans. Finally, Kyle Katarn's initials are KK, i.e. K2. Thank you very much for the email, Dawson. So, Kyle Katarn was around during the Yuuzhan Vong War. He just wasn't used in the New Jedi Order book series that much, other than one mention, I believe, in the final book, The Unifying Force. But he was used in the Dark Forces saga game packs of the Star Wars tabletop role-playing game during that time. Remember, Kyle Katarn was introduced in the original Dark Forces video game, and in Legends, he mostly remained in the video game or role-playing game realm after that. Now, as for K2SO being an analog for Kyle Katarn, Dawson, if that's your headcanon, great. Thank you again for the email. Listener, if you'd like to ask me a question like Leo and Dawson, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message and email it in. Just please record it in MP3 audio format. Now, stick around for the end of the show because I've got a Star Wars character group to share with everyone. It's the first one of those I've gotten in a while. So stay tuned for that, listener. But now it's time for today's book, Lando Calrissian and the Starcave of Thonboka by L. Neil Smith. Grab yourself a drink. Let's head in to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. The story begins in deep space, where a large, vacuum-breathing alien is slowly starving. Lando Calrissian and Vufi Ra find the creature, who they discover is extremely intelligent. The being says its name is Lahisu, and tells our heroes that its people, the Oswaft, are being blockaded inside their home nebula by the Centrality Navy. The Navy is poisoning the interstellar chemicals that the Oswaft eat. At first, Lando is reluctant to get involved with the situation, but when the gambler discovers that Lahisu and the Oswaft can use the chemicals they eat to produce virtually anything, including valuable gems and minerals, Lando orders Vufi Ra to set a course to the nebula that Lahisu calls the Thonboka. The Millennium Falcon arrives at the blockade, and Lando sees the size of the naval fleet. His heart sinks. How are he and Vufi Ra going to make it through that many warships? Well, Lando gets an idea. He uses his stash of exotic cigars and alcohol to jump from ship to ship, offering their captains something to break up the monotony and boredom of the months-long siege. Lando cons his way through the fleet, inching closer and closer to the opening of the Starcave. After the Falcon visits a picket ship named the Courteous, Lando orders Vufi Ra to punch it. The Courteous orders the Falcon to stop, but when it doesn't, the captain orders the ship to fire. Just then, Vufi Ra drops a canister containing flammable gases. The shot from the Courteous hits the canister. It explodes and allows the Falcon to sneak into the Thonboka. Elsewhere in the galaxy, Roker Gepta and the survivors of Renatasia, led by Klin Shanga, learn that the Millennium Falcon has been spotted by the Centrality Navy. The two don't like each other, but they're willing to work together if it allows them to get their revenge. Klin Shanga and the Renatasians on Vufi Ra, who they blame for the destruction of their world, and Roker Gepta on Lando Calrissian, the gambler who has thwarted his plans at Sharu and Ascian. Before they set off in pursuit, Gepta brings on an anthropologist named Osuno Wet to study the Oswaft, and, if required, to show Gepta how to destroy them. Lahisu introduces Lando to the Oswaft elders. The aliens are 3 times as big as Lahisu, about the size of a small capital ship. Lando offers to help defeat the blockade in exchange for a full shipment of the gems the Oswaft can produce. The elders agree, but first they want to try to negotiate. One of the elders leads a delegation of Oswaft out of the Starcave. The elder tries to talk to the Courteous and accidentally destroys it. Immediately, the Navy opens fire on the group of Oswaft, wiping them out. Lando comes up with a plan to defeat the blockade without the Oswaft needing to attack the Navy ships. The Oswaft have an ability. They can make short hyperspace jumps, leaving fake images of themselves in their wake. Lando tells the Oswaft to hop between the ships, leave fake projections of themselves, and hop again. The plan works almost perfectly, as the Navy cruisers fire their turbo lasers at the fake images of the Oswaft and blast each other. Just then, Roker Gepta's capital ship arrives. He orders the Navy to stop firing, and when they do, Gepta launches an electromagnetic torpedo into the Thonboka, killing dozens of Oswaft. The sorcerer sends a call-out on all frequencies. He challenges Lando to a duel in space. If the gambler doesn't accept, Gepta says he will destroy the Thonboka. Lando agrees, he puts on a spacesuit, and he and Vufi Ra head out to confront the Sorcerer of Tund. With all eyes on Lando and Gepta, Klin Shanga orders his men to their fighters. Regardless of the outcome of the duel, the Renatasians vow to destroy Vufi Ra. Curiously, Osuno Wet also says he wants to kill Vufi Ra and jumps into his own ship. Something about the anthropologist nags at Klin Shanga. Why does he care about Vufi Ra? And why does his voice sound so familiar? The duel begins, and quickly Roker Gepta gets the upper hand. Vufi Ra tries to help Lando by detaching its mechanical arms and attack Gepta. Just then, the Renatasian fighters streak past. Klin Shanga sees Vufi Ra's arms crawling all over the sorcerer and realizes the truth. Vufi Ra is really just a droid, just like he told him in the Osean asteroid field. In that moment, Shanga remembers why he recognizes Osuno Wet's voice. The anthropologist was with Vufi Ra when the Empire arrived at Renatasia. Osuno Wet is the real butcher that the Renatasians have been looking for all along. Shanga orders his fighters to fire on Wet's ship. The explosion distracts Roker Gepta. When the sorcerer turns, Lando draws his sting beam and fires. The bolt hits Gepta, but it doesn't kill the sorcerer. Instead, Gepta's body starts to disappear and shrink inside his spacesuit. Lando grabs the suit and feels around. He finds something tiny crawling around the bottom of one of the legs. It's a croak, a small mollusk-like creature who can use the Force to make itself look like a much larger being. This is Roker Gepta, the Sorcerer of Tund. Lando squeezes the croak in his grip and crushes it, bringing an end to Roker Gepta. When the battle is over, a fleet of mechanical lifeforms arrive, larger than any capital ships Lando has ever seen. The new aliens claim to be Vufi Ra's creators. They say they built the little droid years ago and sent it out into the galaxy to record its experiences with other sentient species. Now, they say it's time to come home. The story ends with Lando and Vufi Ra parting ways. Lahisu asks the gambler if he plans to continue wandering the galaxy trying to make his fortune in Sabacc. No, Lando says. I think it's time to settle down and build something. And all the Oswaft gems in the cargo hold will give me a good start. Time to take a break. When we return, I'll talk more about Lando Calrissian and the Starcave of Thonboka. I'm Aaron Moats. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But let me take a moment and recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Thrawn is a story full of smugglers, pirates, and political infighting. See how the brilliant Chiss tactician climbed his way up the ranks of the Imperial Navy, with a little help from his reluctant aide, Eli Vanto. Check out Thrawn by Timothy Zahn. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats, and today I'm talking about the novel Lando Calrissian and the Starcave of Thonboka by L. Neil Smith, the final book in the Legends Lando Calrissian Adventures. So listener, as you could tell, the plot summary at the beginning of this episode was a little shorter than the plot summaries for the first two Lando Calrissian adventures. And that's because there just wasn't as much plot in this final installment. It's just Lando and Vufi Ra happen across Lahisu out in space. The Oswaft convinces them to come help its people as they're being blockaded by the Centrality Navy. Lando and Vufi Ra come up with a plan for the Oswaft to defeat the Navy without having to destroy the ships themselves. The plan works. And then Roker Gepta and Klin Shanga show up, wanting to get the revenge on Lando and Vufi Ra, respectively. Lando fights Roker Gepta. Klin Shanga realizes that Vufi Ra is just a droid. And after Lando defeats Roker Gepta, Lando reaps the rewards of the precious gems that the Oswaft can create. That's it. That's the story. It is a very simple, straightforward plot. But there are some cool things in this story. Of the three, it's the only one where Lando doesn't face some trumped up charges to coerce him into doing something for the authorities in the system in which he finds himself. We see some character growth in Lando in this story. He decides that, yes, he and Vufi Ra are going to help this group of aliens because if not, eventually they're going to go extinct. Now, that's not to say that all of Lando's motivations are altruistic. Of course, he only decides to help Lahisu after he learns about the treasures in the Thonboka. But still, Lando does decide to help a group who are being persecuted by a military that simply is afraid of them. Because these spacefaring aliens can travel through hyperspace. They're huge. They possibly could pose a danger to shipping lanes. If you think about that in canon, we get that with the Purrgil space whales from Rebels and from the Ahsoka live-action television show. There are certain similarities between what the government thinks about the Purrgil in canon and what the Centrality government thinks about the Oswaft here in this story. The Oswaft are described as looking like a cross between a manta ray and a jellyfish, using two very real-world animals as descriptions. They have the ability to hop through hyperspace. So, not exactly the same way that we see the Purgle enter hyperspace and travel long distances at light speed. The way the Oswaft are described in this story, it's more like they pop in and out, almost like they disappear in one spot and just reappear in another spot. They are highly intelligent creatures. The Oswaft are able to understand basic speech within minutes of hearing Lando and Vufira try to communicate with them. At one point, Lando plays a sabacc game with the elders of the Oswaft. And within moments of being introduced to the game, the elders understand exactly how to play, what the purpose is. The only thing that they have trouble with is the Oswaft Code of Conduct does not allow them to lie. So they have a lot of problems bluffing. And that is where Lando defeats the elders in the sabacc game. It's funny because every time Lando wins a hand, he'll say, well, I'm now 93 million up on you. Of course, they're not really betting with anything. The Oswaft do not recognize currency. They don't have the need for any currency. Something like that is completely foreign to their way of mind. But they have the ability to create minerals using the interstellar chemicals that drift through the Thonboka Nebula. Using these minerals, they can create precious gems. And Lando notices how the walls, quote unquote walls, of the Starcave, where the Oswaft live in the middle of the nebula, seem to be littered with these precious gems. To the Oswaft, these gems have no value. These minerals that they can create have no value. They're just things that they plaster up along the walls of the Thonboka. So when Lando says he will help them defeat the naval blockade in exchange for some of these gems, basically an entire cargo hold, whatever the Millennium Falcon can hold, the Oswaft are fine with it. I mean, what do they need these things that they just plaster the walls of the nebula with? They don't need them for anything. Now, I will say one of the few things in all of these stories, the Lando Calrissian adventures, that I am not a fan of is the revelation that Roker Gepta is just this very tiny snail-like / mollusk-like creature called a croak. Now, the croaks are intelligent. They have the ability to use the Force. That ability manifests itself in the Croak's ability to produce very realistic illusions. And that's what this Croak had done. It created the illusion that it was a sorcerer of Tund. Because Roker Gepta was the big bad guy throughout all three of these stories, I just felt the final duel between Roker Gepta and Lando Calrissian was anticlimactic. You know, in Star Wars, specifically in the original trilogy, because this book was published in 1983, Return of the Jedi had been released in 1983. So, obviously, L. Neil Smith had been working on these three stories prior to the release of Return of the Jedi. However, it was after the release of The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, because we have Lando Calrissian. But if you think about it, in all three of the original trilogy movies, we built up to a huge climax in each of the films. The Battle of Yavin at the end of A New Hope, with the X-Wings going against the Death Star, the trench run, the Imperials led by Darth Vader, destroying the rebel ships left and right until there were only a handful left, and the only one left in the trench was Luke. Of course, the end of The Empire Strikes Back. Han gets frozen in carbonite, is given to Boba Fett. It looks like Leia and Chewie are going to be turned over to the Empire until Lando frees them. And then, of course, Vader setting the trap for Luke. And then the ending of Return of the Jedi, with the three different battles at the end of the movie, on the ground at Endor, in space around the second Death Star, and in the throne room between Luke, Vader, and the Emperor. All of these are huge climaxes. In the vast majority of Star Wars material, whether it's in the books, in the movies that followed, in the television shows, whether they are live action or animated, the vast majority of them build up to a huge final confrontation, and this story fails in that, in my opinion. That's not to say it wasn't well written. That's not to say that doing something different isn't a good thing. Because in general, I believe it is. So I appreciate that the author, L. Neil Smith, did something different with the climax of the Lando Calrissian adventures. It just doesn't work for me. And then after the duel, we have like 3 or 4 pages left in the story. And then these humongous mechanical beings that kind of resemble very smooth, cigar-shaped, saucer-shaped ships show up because they have the ability to track Vufi Ra without Vufi Ra's knowledge. We learned that these were Vufi Ra's creators. When Lando first meets Vufi Ra, the little droid says it can't access some memories from before the time at Renetasia, including its creation and who its creators are. Well, we learn that these are the creators. I understand that by the end of this book, we have to get Lando and Vufi-Ra apart from each other. Because at the end of the Starcave of Thonboka, Lando has to make his way to Bespin. Now, I find it interesting that he heads off to Bespin with this cargo full of these valuable gems, so he can just basically buy Cloud City when he gets there. I mean, that's fine. This way's fine. Just going in and buying it. Okay, that's cool. That works for me. But I do wish the author had given more time to how Lando and Vufi-Ra were eventually going to separate. It just feels very quick to me. I think I would have found it a little more satisfying if in the first two books, The Mind Harp of Sharu and The Flame Wind of Ossian, if L. Neil Smith had dropped a few more hints about Lando and Vufi-Ra eventually going their separate ways. Regardless, these are stories from a different era. These are stories from the early 80s. They're very quick adventure stories. They're much more science fiction than the space fantasy in some ways that Star Wars is. But you got to remember, these came in the wake of the Han Solo adventures from the late 70s and the original Marvel comic Star Wars runs of the late 70s and early 80s. All of the stories printed then in these books, in these comics, except for maybe Splinter of the Mind's Eye, were exciting, fast adventure stories. They were fun. They were fun to read. It's what kept people's attention on Star Wars, particularly young people, kids, teenagers. Do these stories hold up today? Probably not. But you just got to remember that these stories were from another age. If you enjoy a fun, fast adventure story with pretty low stakes, the Lando Calrissian adventures, for the most part, hit that sweet spot. And it's always fun for me to go back and review these stories. So, it's now almost time to go. But before I do, I've got a Star Wars character group to share with everyone. It's the first one of these we've had in a while. Today's group comes from Eric, who decided to plop his favorite Star Wars characters into an office-style sitcom. But first, Eric asks, since paper isn't used in the Star Wars galaxy, what product would this office be producing? So, Eric, I thought for a little bit on this, and the first thing that came to mind for me was Durasteel, the strong Star Wars metal used in everything from building construction to personal armor to starship hulls. And of course, one of these companies would have a sales and customer service office. So, Eric's office cast includes branch manager Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Revenge of the Sith era, human resources C-3PO. By the way, that is low-key the funniest of the selections that you made, Eric. C-3PO as HR. Perfect. Receptionist, Padme Amidala. The sales team is Revenge of the Sith era Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, Mace Windu, Plo Koon, and Kanan Jarrus. Quality assurance, Grand Admiral Thrawn. Customer service, Leia Organa and Ezra Bridger. Eric has decided that Chopper from Rebels will handle security. And the warehouse/delivery team will consist of Han Solo, Chewbacca, Wicket, Zeb Aurelius, and Hera Syndulla. That's a great list, Eric, although I do have one question. On both the British and American versions of The Office, one of the funniest things is the fact that David Brent and Michael Scott are terrible bosses and extremely awkward people. I'm not sure how well Obi-Wan Kenobi fits that description. Honestly, wouldn't that be someone more like Jar Jar Binks, minus some of the slapstick comedy? Anyway, just something to think about. This is your list, and again, it's a great character grouping. Now, listener, if you have a Star Wars character group you'd like to share with me, like Eric did, send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. You can ask me a question, send me a comment, or offer an opinion about something I've said on the show. And if you want a book recommendation, shoot me a message. I'll answer you. I love hearing from all of you. Now, coming up on the next episode, we'll jump ahead to the time of Return of the Jedi. It's another short story anthology, The Tales from Jabba's Palace, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. You can look forward to that episode coming out on March 21st. And again, if you want to see the full schedule for 2025, listener, you can check out the posts that are pinned on my Blue Sky and Twitter pages. You can see all the books that I plan to read for the remainder of this year. Once again, thank you so much for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Moats. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in legends.